How are surging interest rates likely to impact the securitization market? To get the answer to this question and much more, stay tuned to the Expert Lounge, a podcast by India Ratings and Research, a Fitch Group company. Because ultimately, for opinions on risk and credit, India comes to us. Hi, I'm Siddharth Rego. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our listeners, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. And welcome to the Expert Lounge. Today's topic for discussion is the impact of surging interest rates on the securitization market. And Rajashri Roy is today's expert who will help us understand this topic way better. So, Rajashri, welcome to the Expert Lounge.
Thanks, Siddharth. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And for all our listeners who don't know, Rajashri Roy is an associate director in India Rating Structured Finance team. And she's recently published a very well received article. And might I add, it's really interesting. And let's just deep dive into today's topic. So, Rajashri, interest rates are rising and have risen by about 100 to 200 basis points over the recent past. So, how do you see these rising interest rates impacting the securitization market over the near term?
So, Siddharth, we believe that the rising rates can impact securitization in two ways. Firstly, there may be some impact on the volumes of securitization,
Right.
especially in the asset classes which have fixed interest rates, like commercial vehicles or tractors, and even secured and unsecured business loans.
Right.
And more especially in the securitization of the non priority sector lending pools.
Okay.
So in the PSL lending space, the volumes would not be as impacted because investors would have a regulatory requirement for such loans.
Okay.
Um, so this is one way in which the rising interest rates would impact securitization.
Right.
And secondly, this could also impact the asset quality in certain asset classes,
Okay.
especially those with floating interest rates.
Right.
And we at India Ratings would be monitoring these delinquencies very closely in the coming months.
I picked up on two very interesting aspects of that answer which you gave. So, the first part relates to the securitization volumes and the impact on that. And the second part is on the asset quality impact. So, let's probably speak about the first part, first on the securitization volumes. Rajeshri, how do you expect the securitization volumes to be impacted over the near term?
So, for the securitization transactions which have a tenure of more than 2 years,
Okay.
we have MHP norms or minimum holding period norms, which are prescribed by RBI.
Right.
And this requires that all loans would have a minimum seasoning of 6 months.
6 months, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
So for securitization in the short term, in June or July or in the coming few months, the pool of eligible loans would have been originated at a time when the interest rates were at historically low levels.
Okay.
So this would affect the fixed interest rate asset classes,
Right.
since interest rates will remain fixed for those loans even in a rising interest rate environment.
Right.
So when these loans would be securitized, because of the rise in interest rates, PTC investors may expect higher yields.
Interesting.
So this would potentially reduce the spreads in the transaction.
Very interesting. Very interesting. What about floating rate pools?
So the mortgage loan pool transactions, the ones that you mentioned, are the floating rate pools. Over there, these pools would maybe have a limited impact from, especially from the contraction in the pool spread, the transaction spreads, because the loans could potentially, since they have floating rate loans, the pool yields could also potentially rise, and hence we don't expect that kind of a impact in terms of the pool spreads.
Okay, not much over here.
Yes. But however, for these pools, the asset quality would be key, and we would be monitoring those.
Interesting. So asset quality is something to be monitored. What do you see happening over here in terms of asset quality? How do you expect things to play out over here?
So, as I had mentioned earlier, also a sharp rise in interest rates would affect the borrowers with floating interest rate loans, like home loans or LAB, and this would be more impactful for those borrowers who have lesser financial flexibilities, like those in the affordable housing space.
Okay. Okay.
So the affordability of the customers may get impacted if rates are hiked even further.
Okay.
And even in the lab pools that are securitized, a large part of them is made up of the small business borrowers.
Oh, okay.
And this segment is more vulnerable to the rising interest rate environment, as they do not have a great ability to pass on these rising costs to their customers.
Right.
So the challenges of inflation and also coupled with the rate hike together could lead to a higher capital working capital requirement in these businesses, and hence lead to a weakening cash flow.
Interesting. So basically, the small business owners, they are likely to be more vulnerable, right?
Yes.
Right. Interesting. And what about the other asset classes, Rajashri?
The other asset classes which could be impacted would be the unsecured asset classes, like the unsecured consumer loans, as well as even the business loans, because the pressure on the borrower's liquidity, could lead to higher delinquencies in the near term. And hence, as mentioned, we will continue to monitor the asset quality across all pools in the near term in India ratings.
Right. That was very helpful, Rajashri. So if I had to just kind of sum up what you said in a nutshell, the rising interest rates are likely to have firstly an impact on the securitization volumes, and secondly, it could have a potential impact on the underlying asset quality, right? That's the key takeaway, right?
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Rajashri. Thank you for your time. And it was great to have you on the Expert Lounge. I hope our listeners enjoyed this podcast and found it really useful. In case you're interested in gaining a deeper insight on today's topic, feel free to check out the article which Rajashri has authored. The link is given along with the podcast. And in the meanwhile, we look forward to engaging with you in the next podcast. So do stay tuned for the Expert Lounge, brought to you by India Ratings and Research, a Fitch Group company. Because ultimately, for opinions on risk and credit, India comes to us.